And thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. My name is Gurmeher Kaur. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the ambassador for, one of the ambassadors for Digital Peace Now with Raj, and I'm super excited to be moderating this workshop with you.
Thanks, Yamaha. My pronouns are he, him, his. Now, just before we jump in, I should say there is only one rule for this session, and it's an important one. As you can probably tell, Gurmahar and I are relatively casual, and we'd like to hear your thoughts and ideas. I know it's a little bit tricky in this virtual space that we find ourselves in, but we do have a room chat just on the left-hand side of your, or should be on the left-hand side of your screen. Hopefully you can navigate to the room chat. We like to take questions live and as they come in, so please do throw your questions, queries, anything that you might have just into that chat, and we'll address it as best we can. I think the idea is that we want to learn collaboratively and from one another. I think there's 38 phenomenal participants here. And if you're at a conference like this, then you have something valuable to add, and we want to hear it, or at the very least, read it. So please do contribute as best you can. Now, I think a really good starting point is just to set the scene. What are we talking about when we say cyber warfare and cyber attacks? Instead of me rambling on in my Australian accent, I figured we might just throw it to a video to handle that. So bear with me one sec. I'll throw that on and we'll jump straight in. I am so sorry. I think we might have had some technical issues. That Welcome to Virtual's world. I will have a link for everyone because I think that just might be easier at some point. You might have to watch that by yourselves. Bear with me one sec. I'll paste that into the chat. There we go. It is just a quick 5-minute video, so please do take your time to watch that in your own time, obviously. But let me give you a quick recap. Again, I guess rambling on in my Australian accent. Essentially, what we have seen in the last, I guess, more recent, let's say 5 to 10 years, is a significant increase in the way that digital technology has been used in warfare or within the warfare context. So not only or no longer do you now just need guns, missiles, weapons. All it takes is someone who's motivated, not even well-resourced. The barrier to entry for cyber warfare is quite low. For someone who's motivated and has access to a laptop and can infiltrate a system, can cause some significant damage to infrastructure, hospitals, power grids, banking systems, financial systems, education systems. All of this has a profound and, I guess, devastating impact on, generally speaking, the most vulnerable in our community, civilians. So that's essentially what the video is talking about. I hope that's enough to set the scene, but we are going to delve into some of these cyber attacks a little bit further on in our workshop, but obviously that is the focus point about what we're going to be speaking of. I'm sure that everybody here has probably heard of WannaCry or ransomware attacks. The idea behind this workshop, though, is primarily looking at state-sponsored cyber warfare. Now, Namaste, Raju, thank you. Jumping into some of the lexicography, the wording that can be used when discussing this topic, I think it's a good idea to just run through some of the basic terms that we often hear, but can get mixed in with a lot of different lexicons, and it can make it difficult to dissect and understand what we're really speaking of. So the first word is state-sponsored cyber attacks or cyber warfare. Now, what that means, Joni, people saying they can't hear me. Am I audible? Can people hear me?
I can hear you.
I can. Loud and clear.
Yep.
You, Daniel? Beautiful. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm assuming if you are having audio issues, it must just be on your end, but please do let us know if that continues. Where was I? Yes, state-sponsored cyber warfare. So, using similar techniques as perpetrators of cyber attacks, so these are your everyday Joes, the hackers who are trying to infiltrate your banking system or your computer so they can ransom off your data. State-sponsored cyber attackers use very similar techniques, but they're sponsored by governments, which means they have quite an endless supply of resources when it comes to funding and technology, and they generally use these systems and these techniques to attack government systems of other nations. They can also use it to attack civil society infrastructure as well, which is obviously going to have an impact on a fellow government's control and ability to govern, which is, again, something that we do need to take quite seriously. I mean we've all heard stories of 2016 and some of the issues that impacted democratic processes. More recently, we've had attacks on hospitals and education systems, so all of which is quite important. More granular, just a cyber attack is a malicious attack designed to penetrate a computer system or network, and it's generally financially motivated. So the distinction there is that prefix state-sponsored and then just a cyber attack. When you put the two together, they can be quite different. Hybrid warfare, that's a term that we do often hear. It blends conventional warfare, or irregular warfare and cyber warfare, with other influencing methods, such as fake news, diplomacy, lawfare, and foreign electoral intervention. Another word that you'll hear quite often is ransomware. It's a pretty popular type of malware and a crypto virology that threatens to publish victims like personal data or IP and perpetually block access unless a ransom is paid, generally in Bitcoin or any one of your other like cryptocurrencies, the more popular ones. And obviously, we do have other terms like DDoS, which is a denial of service attack, which is just a repeated attempt to get into a system. Those are the general words. If anything else does pop up, or if you hear me say a term that you're not too sure of, like I said, throw it into the chat and we'll be happy to take it from there. Yeah. Now, what we're going to talk about is, are we actually aware? How much do we actually know about cyber attacks within our own communities? For that, I'm going to pass on over to Gurmaha.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you so much for introducing this very important topic. I know when we talk about cyber warfare, there seems multiple ideas come to our mind. We think about misinformation, disinformation, and the lexicon and the words that we just recently heard about. But we've all we've all heard about cyber attacks around the world. But the question really here is, but do we really understand their potential impact? Every year the number of attacks and the sophistication increases. Take last year, for example, while the world fought against COVID-19, we saw an increase, we saw the significant increase in the number of attacks on healthcare and medical research facilities. There was one in India that I remember very clearly where this is where I was living. While it's deeply concerning, do we really understand the magnitude of the impact that cyber warfare can have on our society? Do we have any thoughts and feelings? No thoughts and feelings? Anyone in the chat? Well, all right. The truth here is the internet that we know and we love has been weaponized. Just as we're reliant on online networks, so are our governments, critical infrastructure, and economies. State-sponsored cyber attacks are state-sponsored cyber attacks are being used to attack other nations, political enemies, and also private companies. And many of these attacks, they fall into this gray area of international attack, which often making it extremely difficult for the victims to know how to respond. And before we, and while we talk about what a state-sponsored cyber attack is, I feel it's very important for me to, make the distinction between what a state-sponsored cyber attack is and what a cybercrime is. And these two should not be, these two should not be confused. So what a cybercrime a cybercrime is initiated by criminals usually to make themselves richer. All of those scams, asking you to click on dubious links, or those stories of customer data being stolen. All of these are works of cyber criminal. Now, nation-sponsored cyber attacks are, when nations use cyber weapons to potentially interfere with critical infrastructure. So think power grids, nuclear reactor, water facilities, to destabilize other governments. Again, think about it when we talk about destabilization. Think interfering with elections, hacking into government agencies, shutting down municipal services, stealing personal data and intellectual properties, and sort of silencing oppositions. And the thing is, the nation-backed hackers will often use very similar techniques as cyber criminals to get into the networks of the targets. But their motivations, and this is critical, the difference between a cyber crime and a cyber-sponsored attack, it is the motivation. The motivation for nation-backed cyber attacks will always be political, and their directives will come straight from the government. So unlike private criminals, state-sponsored groups, they are funded by the country's war chest, which can often and does act like unlimited funding to hire and carry out cyber attacks. And now we're going to go into a discussion. And this is my question to you. I hope the chat's working now. What, do you guys remember what your initial reaction to the issue was, and what your level of awareness was before we just had this discussion?
I guess if I could just jump in, yeah. Yeah, essentially just how did you feel when you hear cyber warfare? What came to mind, or cyber attacks? What comes to mind? Yeah, so Brandon, that's a really good point. Like you're aware that it exists, it's out there in the ether, but it doesn't really impact you. Or for a lot of people, it's not a direct impact.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Conspiracy, very interesting. Melvin. Jessica, difficult to attack. Efforts to destabilize trust in elections, and this is something we've seen during the last United States elections.
I think Guy raises a really, really
Sorry.
complex point. Yeah. Um,
That's such an important point, Guy. Daniel, would you want to maybe talk more about it? Often cyber delivered information warfare and cyber warfare are two concepts very similarly and very closely linked to each other. And you're right that these are the two things that come to your mind when we talk about the issue of cyber warfare. Lynn, very important. You do raise one of the most important points, which is threats to democracy. Increase in polarization in many countries, and of course, you do point out. You do talk about the involvement of Russia in many of the attacks, which we will now talk about. Um, and it's something that we have also seen in India, how cyber warfare can be used to really destabilize democratic nations, and not just here, but across the world. But also, when we think about it, these are our first initial thoughts, but to, let's go on and focus the conversation a bit more. What do you think are some of the key critical infrastructures, that can be targeted, and how do you think they impact you? And also, another thing to think about, when we talk about cyber attacks that impact you versus cyber warfare that could impact you. Has anyone here ever received a random email that looks like a cyber attack? Click on this link and you'll get a lot of money, etc. All the time, yeah. Say my inbox is full of it. And let's think about it. How does that cyber attack, on us, how does that impact, how do you think it impacts us as an individual? We're very scared of giving away our financial information, very our information to our yeah, distrust, exactly, yeah. Loss of personal information, yep. Credit card companies, businesses we use, 100%. And now let's think about how cyber warfare impacts us. Chris says, I think it forces us to operate with a higher level of suspicion at all times. I look at any online communication from an unknown person or a source with skepticism. Very true. Melinda makes me think I'd rather we without the internet, social media altogether. Or Melinda, we could work towards protecting the space, and we'll talk a lot more about it. So when we just going over cyber attacks that impact us as an individual versus cyber warfare that impacts cyber warfare that impacts us. The thing is, it's not just the governments, hospitals, universities. When we talk about cyber warfare, it's not just it's the governments, hospital, universities, banks, power grid, news agencies that are that are attacked, and every year the number of attacks and this sophistication keeps increasing. And we're going to, let's do this thing. Have you heard about, there are some, I'll talk about a few very well-known cyber attacks to sort of give you an idea to give you an idea of what a state-sponsored cyber attack have already taken place. So does anyone remember Sony? Or Stuxnet? So Stuxnet in 2010, it's a nuclear program in Iran attributed to the US, and it was an attack on a nuclear program in Iran, and it was attributed to the United States and Israel.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here as well, just on Stuxnet. I mean, don't get me wrong. My philanthropic efforts for the princes of the world, I've done my fair share of helping princes get back to their fortune with small donations. That's a really personalized example of like a cyber attack on you, right? You're receiving those links and calls asking specifically for you to give up your information or your financial information or literally money. These attacks much broader, and I think Gurmaha, you raised a really interesting one with Stuxnet first. This was in 2010, right? Hackers actually destabilized the centrifuges of a nuclear reactor. It literally caused them to spin too fast and then shut down. And that was in 2010, right? So people with a computer around the world have somehow managed to do that to a nuclear reactor. That blew my mind. And I think that was the first realization of like, wow, this could have profound impacts all across the world. If we can shut down nuclear reactors and not just make them peacefully shut down, but damage them, damaging critical infrastructure that requires physical repair. I think that was one of the first points where attacks went from being this conceptual cyber world thing to it can transcend the digital barrier and literally reach out and attack critical infrastructure that's important to our daily lives. Gurmaha, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Raj, for talking about it. So I'm going to take this moment to quiz everyone and sort of get your attention back and get you all engaging. And thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you so much, Heather, for this very interesting podcast recommendation. I'd love to look at it. But just to get your attention back and to quiz you a little bit, has any of you heard about WannaCry, for example? Can anyone here tell me what the attack was? And maybe details of its impact? WannaCry was an attack on healthcare systems that was attributed to North Korea, and it happened in United Kingdom when the NHS systems were hacked into and shut down. And the impact of it was when your healthcare system, a lot of appointments for patients with life-threatening diseases, life-threatening issues were cancelled. People who were going into surgeries were cancelled. And when we think about cyber warfare, we often think it's just the computers that are being hurt. But when you see the almost trickle down effect of it, especially with WannaCry, you see how vulnerable just everyday civilians are, and especially when it comes down to healthcare, right? Already a space where, as civilians, you are in a position of suffering, in a position of vulnerability, and today from any country could attack another country's healthcare system and destabilize the civilians' health and health and well-being.
Yeah, if I can also, just jump in here for WannaCry as well. That was probably one of the most prolific cyber attacks, I guess in recent history. Actually, maybe not immediately recent history, but early on, I'd say like pre 2019. WannaCry actually was a global attack, simply because of how virulent and how transmissive the actual ransomware was. And so collectively, I think rough direct estimates predicted around, I think it was about 10 to $15 billion worth of damage. With indirect numbers, I mean, analysts vary on this, but some have predicted that it could go up to the $100 billion mark, because of just how many computer systems were impacted. And at that time, a lot of critical infrastructure and government workers, like government agencies, were still using computer systems that were a little bit older, and hadn't been updated to protect them against these sorts of attacks. And so just because of that, we saw global destabilization of cyber networks. And in particular, as Yamaha mentioned, it was hospital systems within the UK, which obviously meant innocent civilians who needed healthcare, that were impacted the most. Back to you,
Yeah.
Yamaha.
And talking about these cyber attacks, I'm going to name a few more, and feel free to search them up. Colonial pipelines, SolarWinds. We spoke about Stuxnet, NotPetya, JBS Meat Supplier. So these are some very recent cyber attacks that have occurred in all of last year. But I have another question to you, having now spoken about a couple of cyber attacks and coming to a sort of awareness of the impacts these cyber attacks have. Do you feel like we should be more concerned about the threat of cyber warfare than we already are? Mm-hmm. Yep. I completely agree with all of you. You know, over I completely agree with all of you. Over 60 nations are currently developing offensive cyber technologies that, if deployed, would likely impact civilian population and disproportionately affect the most marginalized communities. And it's extremely scary. And just to sort of think about it further, what do you think are the biggest barriers? What do you think now that we've heard about cyber warfare, we've come to a realization that this concern, this threat is very real. We are living in a world where cyber attacks are happening almost constantly. In all of last year, like we mentioned, in all of COVID year, there were multiple attacks on healthcare facilities in the world while the world was going through this pandemic. I can name 10 right now. But what do you think, the biggest barriers are for people to understand the gravity of the threat posed by cyber warfare and state-sponsored cyber warfare? Individually and state incentives to increase security of organizations. Yep. Melvin says we need more public awareness. Would you have any ideas about how maybe we could how we could work on this public awareness? Melinda, we won't understand the gravity unless it happens to us individually or as a community. You would be surprised that cyber attacks are constantly happening. Lack of technology expertise. Ethan, would you like to maybe expand on that comment? Could be, yeah, I completely agree. Could be organizing their school curriculums, to help the next generation to learn how cyberspace impacts everyone. Lynn, you make a very, very, very sharp point. This is something that's happened, that's happened with countries. In fact, it's a conversation I was having with someone yesterday, where there was an attack on in the Mumbai power grid. The attack covered by the New York Times, it was attributed to China, but when it came down to local governments, there was a lot of, there was a lack of transparency about that cyber attack to civilians. And I think it's very, very important for nations and governments to be very transparent, about when the attack has happened. All right, Raj, over to you. We've had a lovely discussion.
That we have, and thank you to everyone who's posting in the chat. Some of these points are just incredible. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. So now that we've got a big picture, or I guess a macro idea of what's happening, I think the reality is that it's not just up to governments to generate a response to cyber attacks and cyber warfare. If left to their own devices, I think it's quite evident that it would become quite more prolific. So different groups have different advantages and can pull their levers of influence to enact change. If you're at a conference like this, then you obviously care about peace building, about creating change, and I guess pushing peace into any spaces that you're part of. The cyber world and cyberspace should be one of those. It's up to us to raise our voices and convince our world leaders, policymakers, businesses, and I guess the wider public more generally, to make addressing cyber warfare a top priority. The million, billion, trillion dollar question, though, is how. Now, what I'd like to do is, before we jump in, I think the chat is a great place to start with this, and that's been good. So if you still do have thoughts, please jot them down. But what I have created is a Menti hashtag engagement. So whip out your digital devices, if that's a phone, iPad, another tab on your computer. I will share a link to a Menti page. Just pop the code in that's at the top, and just throw in some words or ideas that we can, I guess, discuss out loud based on the questions in the Menti. Give me 1 sec. Let me bring that up for you all. And as always, if you have any questions, queries, concerns, or it's not working for you, just throw it into the chat, and we'll do our best to fix that up. Okay, so just Joe. It's 4:30, 5 a.m. In Melbourne, so please forgive me. Just go to, please, menti.com.au and just pop in the code. Just while you're all doing that, Melinda, you asked a good question. Why is it hard for policymakers to recruit cyber experts? Distrust in state entities. That's a very complex and nuanced question. I'd say, and something that we have experienced and we've noticed is obviously technology is a rapidly moving, rapidly evolving sort of beast, if you can call it that. And so generally speaking, given the wheels of government tend to move a little bit slower than the pace at which technology actually propagates, we do find that policy often lags behind the adaptive changes that technology is making. We've seen that in, I guess, misinformation, disinformation. We've seen that in combat against, the big tech companies. And so for policymakers, it's, I think, a pivot in how they're actually looking at problems, because to obviously legislate and find rules for cyber peace and cyber warfare and like combating cyber warfare, you kind of have to be proactive, anticipating what the problems are going to be and creating policy around that that's a bit more defensive. So yeah, that's hopefully some part of an answer for you. We are getting a lot of action on the Menti, which is phenomenal. Thank you very much. So the key question: what role can peace-building organizations and civil society play in ensuring that cyberspace isn't turned into a battlefield. Education is a really good one. A lack of awareness can be a huge barrier for people to understand why they should actually care. Why is this something that I need to invest my time and energy into? And it starts with education and raising awareness. So organizations like the one that is hosting this event, like attending events like this, like Digital Peace Now, the work that we do is crucial in, I guess, humanizing the field. I think Max brought up that word earlier, and I really like that, because at the end of it all, it's a human problem. It's an element of us. We are the ones being impacted. And so being able to connect the idea of cyber attacks and cyber warfare to humans and the impact it has on humans is really important. We've got other ones that are really interesting. Engaging effectively. That's a really interesting one. Whoever had engaging effectively, I invite you to just elaborate a little bit more in the chat, please, because I really think that's interesting. We'll come back to that one because I want to hear what your thoughts are. And another one, translating to the masses. If that was you, also really interesting. If you could elaborate that in the chat, that would be grand. I'll give you guys a couple of moments to do that, please. Just while hopefully those incredible people with those responses are working their way through the chat. Collaboration, mobilization, deepening knowledge, all really, really valuable. Depolarize is another one that I think is quite interesting. Often these debates around cyber warfare and peace can tend to be polarized in the political spectrum, and you end up sort of drawing this line in the middle of like, well, we need to have cyber warfare technology to protect ourselves. We need to be investing into cyber warfare technologies. And I think what that sort of leans towards is quite an aggressive or I guess a nationalist perspective, which just pits nation states against one another. And so yeah, depolarizing the discussion can be quite important. Engaging actors beyond government like civil society as well as academia and the private sector. Yeah, that's a really good one. This isn't just a single stakeholder issue. This is something that we all have to come together. It impacts businesses. Microsoft is one of the most attacked entities on Earth, and they provide a lot of the computer infrastructure that we use day to day. Like, I'm on a Windows computer, so they need to have a voice. Civil society, organizations like us who see innocent civilians being impacted, we have to say something, because there are people out there who need support, who might not understand the complexity of this issue and need us to say, hey, this is a problem. How can we do this? So yeah, I definitely agree, Carolina. This is something that has to be more widespread. Now, I'm not sure if the people are going to jump in, but engaging effectively and translating to the masses, I think largely one and the same, but that can be something that is quite difficult to navigate, right? When we talk about cyberspace and digital technologies, it can feel like this complex theory to discuss. We often find ourselves really at odds with understanding some of the lexicography and the language that's used within this space. You feel like you need to have an IT degree or a master's in computer science to understand what's actually happening. And what ends up happening is the masses generally miss the information. They miss the education. Practicing good cyber hygiene, why we have, 8 or more character passwords with unique characters and symbols. FYI, that's because the more you have, the more variations of the password actually exist. And so it's much harder for a computer system to just try get into your system. So if you have, let's say, a 4-digit PIN, there's only, I think, about 10,000 different ways that those 4 digits can be arranged before you have access to that system. You're going to keep guessing and you're going to get it right. With a myriad of, if you have, I think it's 8 characters or more, and they're mixed in with numbers and special symbols, it can be upwards of 1 trillion different variations. So that's why they're that length. Now, I didn't actually know that. It wasn't an academic, and it wasn't a cyber professional who told me that. It was a policy expert who said, this is why we do what we do. And that level of digestibility, applicability to me is what's really important. So whoever said engaging effectively and translating to the masses is spot on with the money there. We're going to go through this one more round. There is another question that I'd like to pick your brains about. How can we better utilize the internet and our collective connectivity to raise awareness about cyber warfare and its impacts? So think about other peace building initiatives or other movements that you've seen. What have they done really well that we can capture? What can we do as cyber citizens? Sorry, I should say, once again, jump into menti.com, just pop in that code, 53652895. Online organizing, yeah, that's a great one. Creating communities online. I don't know you guys, I'm a huge gamer. Love it on any platform, Xbox, PlayStation, PC, PC Master Race for all. And we find ourselves in communities online all the time. I know Gurmaha, you're I guess a wizard when it comes to creating online communities. Would you like to share very quickly how you've done that and what benefit you've derived from it and what change you've had?
I mean, I think one of the most, yeah, I think especially the background that I come from, when we think about access, when we think about access when it comes to, access to information about, political information and knowledge, and communities, we often forget the smaller towns across the world, and we forget that in real life there are a lot of geographical restrictions. So I come from, I'm from India. I'm also from a very small, very small town in Punjab that borders Pakistan. And when I was 19, when I was 19, in my city, there weren't a lot of young people my age, 60. In fact, if I was 16, 17 the first time this happened, there were not a lot of young people my age who were, who wanted to engage in conversations about peace about Indo-Pak peace. And I couldn't find them in my schools. I couldn't find them around, in my physical proximity. However, when I got on the internet, I met a wonderful community of like-minded academics and thinkers and activists, and not just from India, but from across the border. And for the first time, I remember at 17, just looking at what a wonderful tool internet is to form communities, to talk about political issues, and the sort of agency civilians have in that, in this world. Because when we think about an issue like the Indo-Pak conflict, the most conversations for a very long time before the internet and Facebook and social media came into the picture were had by diplomats and people, and these conversations have often been very top down, with what the internet did. It democratized these conversations. It sort of gave agency to civilians, and it also, in a way, just wiped away these national borders for individuals to have one-on-one conversations, which were not possible due to, for example, visa restrictions. And I've used the internet ever since I was 19 to build communities, to be a part of communities. And it's and it's a wonderful tool, and it's also something that we've seen recently, especially last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. And it's something that we saw in India with the second wave of COVID, the Delta wave, where we did not have oxygen cylinders, but a lot of civilians and a whole bunch of youth got together on social media, used the power of the internet, and began creating these Google Docs about oxygen centers in every single city of India, where those centers were, who were people who had oxygen, and just also giving out these calls online about medicines. So the internet has wonderful ways of bringing together people and helping, to the extent that I know for a fact multiple lives were saved just because people knew how to find oxygen and medicine via internet. People created websites for it, public Google Sheets for it, and it's a wonderful tool. I have been a very big fan of sort of utilizing internet as a way of connecting with people, and making our in-person lives better.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of the internet, and I think a lot of those sentiments are sort of shared in the words that we've got on the screen at the moment. I think fundamentally there is a paradigmatic shift in the way that we think about the internet and the way that we interact with one another as human beings. I genuinely believe that we are no longer just like bioorganic entities. I think I don't go any more than, like, I'd say, a meter without my phone being next to me. I think we're very much on the convergence of the techno and biospheres. And so for me, I share my life online as I do offline. To understanding that my communities can be online. I can connect and transcend borders with the click of a button and connect to someone who's somewhere around the world who shares my same passion for saying, you know what, cyber warfare is not something that we can just happily stand by and allow. We should be pushing back against it. Internet use 101, I thought, was a really good one to just highlight, because I guess it starts from a point of education. So how can we better utilize the internet? It's about creating I guess, teaching tools that are, again, translatable to the masses, so that they can understand the world that they're moving into, the cyber world. Frame humanitarian harm. Whoever had that one, I thought that's really fascinating. If that was you, please do just elaborate in the chat. We'll circle back to that one. Open source coding was another one that I thought was really unique, in that the internet does allow us to be quite transparent if we want to be. There's two sides of that coin, of like this ultra secrecy that governments tend to prefer, or there's a nature of just transparency. Being open about how you're communicating, sharing information freely, which is also on there, about decentralizing the control of knowledge that exists. And that's something that we as cyber citizens can do by voicing our opinions, our thoughts, and really putting that in a positive and I guess proactive discourse space, so that you can have those discussions online, to I guess understand the cyber world in which we live in. Melinda brings up Facebook groups like groups of like-minded people. So these allowed me to form friendships during lockdown and meet up in person once it was safe to do so. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's exactly what it's all about. That's what it should be about, connecting people in a positive way. Unfortunately, we have seen, I guess, two sides to every coin that can be used negatively, and that is something that we should work together to curb. But I agree, Melinda, that's spot on. Using the internet to connect with like-minded people. Frame humanitarian harm. I'm going to give it 10 more seconds for someone to jump in. Train community leaders is another great one. Obviously, that stems from education and having leaders within this space to then communicate and educate outwards, and hopefully train the trainers, as it were. Now, I'll look to wrap this up. Andrew, thank you. He says, humanitarian harm. I think it'd be helpful to humanize the impacts. As humanitarians, we've expanded beyond definitions of physical harm to forms of non-physical harm. It would be great if there was a way to better quantify and advocate digital harm from cyber warfare and put that on the agenda of humanitarian actors too. for everybody that's in the chat, I want you to have a read of that, because that is spot on. To quote something that's a little bit Australian, that is the bee's knees of points. Something that we have often struggled with, and it's been raised throughout the chat, but Andrew, thank you for really nailing that and bringing it home, is that we do lack a human element of this. We often just associate cyber warfare, cyber technology, and digital technology. It's over there. It's in the cyber world. It can't touch me. It can't hurt me. The sad reality is that it can do a lot more than just hurt you. We have seen indirectly, we've seen lives lost because of cyber attacks. We've seen hospitals been like core targets simply because they're easily accessible. Infrastructure, power grids have been shut down during cold winter months, which have led people to die of exposure. Like this isn't something that now is relegated to the internet and relegated to a computer screen. Nah, it's not true. So something else that you did mention, Andrew, was a better way to quantify and advocate for digital harm. That is something that we are working on collectively as a community. The UN has open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts. They usually come together to discuss how these things are measured and how these things impact civilians and what sort of policies can be put in place, I guess, not just obviously prevent the cyber attacks from happening, but also measuring them, measuring the impact when they do. So yeah, great point. I might just stop sharing that. Thank you to everyone for participating in that Menti. I find that incredibly valuable, and something that I think, something for me is that every time I do this session, it's very rewarding because it's a two-way street, right? I'm learning just as much as you are, because again, this is not something that I'm not a technological professional. I don't have an IT background. I'm just someone who cares about making sure that the world that I love, the cyber world, is protected and isn't weaponized against us. And currently, it seems that it is. So just to recap some of the key points that we spoke about. So what can we do as cyber citizens? Talk about it, raise awareness, speak out about it. Hopefully you've drawn something out of, I guess, the last 20 minutes and what we've spoken about and how cyber warfare impacts us. Tell people, educate the people around you, do your own research. Cyber hygiene is really important. Having longer and stronger passwords was one of the suggestions earlier. So that forms part of cyber hygiene and how we can protect ourselves. You're more than welcome to follow that little funnel method where you start with yourself. How can I protect myself? And that starts with, I guess, practicing good cyber hygiene. One step above that, how can I protect my community? It becomes discussions about, well, okay, is there government policy that's being debated on the floor? Is there a new incentive, or is there a new rule that's coming in that's going to make it easier for governments to infiltrate other governments? And you slowly build up to the larger topic of state-sponsored cyber warfare. So actually, before I run through my next little spiel, any key takeaways? If I was to say, what would you do to curb the threat of cyber warfare? What comes to mind? Throw that in the chat. And I mean very specifically, what's one action that you can take in the next, let's say, 48 hours? What are you going to do to curb cyber warfare? Just pop it into the chat and we'll talk about it very briefly. I think for me, it's going to be host more of these incredible sessions. That's my one. Gurmaha, what would you do?
Well, I think hosting these sessions, but I think building online communities where conversation, everything that we've spoken in these sessions could be moved to an online room, an online group, and then sort of take up leadership and take it to in person, for example, our schools or our local communities, etc. So just like take information from these, this very international online group of experts and non-experts and civilians who are interested in this topic, and be the leader in our real world, and take it to classrooms and take it to our community centers.
Yeah, nice. Alrighty, I think all of my friends are a little bit shy. That's okay. Some ideas from my end. Actually, Melinda coming in with the goods. Last week, I sat with an elderly neighbor who had thousands of USD stolen by a malicious email. I taught her some things so simple as hovering over the link before clicking. Very small example, very big impact, Melinda. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Just something as simple as that can have a profound impact on another person who might not understand the complexities and the threats that exist within the cyber world. So yeah, I really like that. It starts there. Other examples that I was just going to mention was just talk to one other person about what you've heard about here today, what you've spoken about. If you have, thoughts, digital peace now, just Google it, come back to us. There's a lot of information that is present there. So that's my one thing. If you can talk to one other person in your circle, and we all did that, we can actually start building a grassroots movement, which is, I guess, the goal of all of this. We can't leave it up to the governments and the people at the top of the food chain. It has to come from here, from us, the bottom. Gurmaha,
Yeah.
I'd like to pass it through to you to talk about something that's a little bit more tangible in terms of protecting the internet.
Now that we've spoken about some of these different strategies, thank you to you, Raj, and thank you everyone for thinking this through with all of us. It is a collective community effort to think about these various different strategies. Well, now that we've spoken about it, how it's some of these strategies. How the question now here is, how can we take how can we as individuals use our voice to raise issue about the use our voice to raise awareness about the issue of cyber warfare. I want you, now that we've spoken about these strategies, I want to draw your attention to an initiative that aims to unify nations, civil society, private businesses, and private businesses, and they've sort of brought it around these 9 principles, which is it's called the Paris Peace Call, the Paris Call for Peace and Security in Cyberspace. So the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, it was launched in November 2018, and since its launch, 79 states, 391 civil society organizations, and over 700 private businesses have come together in support of the Paris Call and its core 9 principles. And what are these core 9 principles, you ask me? The first principle is protect critical individuals and infrastructures from malicious cyber activities. Protect the availability and integrity of the internet. Prevent interference aimed at undermining electoral processes, which is critically important. Defend intellectual intellectual property from cyber threats. Prevent proliferation of malicious software and practices. Strengthen the security of digital products and processes. Improve cyber hygiene for all. We've spoken about it. Prevent non-state actors, including the private sector, from hacking back. And ninth, one of the most important principles is strengthen international norms of responsible behavior and build on these confidence building measures. And when I think about international norms, does anyone here have any memories of how, when was the last time we require international norms to protect the world from a weapon? Anyone? Well, just to talk about international norm building, post Cold War, post-World War when United nuclear treaties. That there you are. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. The world has seen so many wars. It is after experiencing this massive destruction. This massive destruction, so much pain, so much damage that the fact that we saw so much damage that the war had done, that the world collectively came together and implemented these international norms. One of them is the NPTs. It's a landmark international treaty to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And now cyber warfare, and now with cyber warfare coming up, this space being exposed, and us being exposed to cyber attacks, it's very, very important for leaders of the world, from leaders of the world, and all the stakeholders to come together and demand for these, and demand for international norms to be applied. And very recently, the European Union and the United States have signed on and joined the Paris Call. And it's their decision that will strengthen the call and enable it to go further in the defense stability of cyberspace. Samrat, would you want to maybe talk more about biological chemical weapons convention? And maybe think through how does a similar, how does that translate into the cyberspace world and norm formation?
So while Samat just touches on that, hopefully in the chat, something that I just wanted to circle back to that I said I would earlier was, forgive me, but somebody said hopelessness, or used the word hopelessness in this discussion, which I thought was really powerful. And the enormity and gravity of the situation and what we're talking about. Don't get us wrong. It's inescapable. It is a big deal. It's a big ask. I mean, we're just lowly me here, trying to combat cyber warfare from government nations. Like, how on earth am I going to have an impact in that? And you're right. I think again, apologies, but the name slips my mind. Whoever said hopelessness, that is a sentiment that I think a lot of us do feel. And it's the feeling that we have when it comes to a lot of geopolitical, social issues that exist. But the key is that we come together cohesively, proactively. We collaborate, and we circle around this one idea. We coalesce around this idea that any protections that apply to humans in the real world should apply to them in the cyber world. And that's all we're trying to do. And initiatives like the Paris Call, and all of the governments and businesses and civil society organizations that have signed on, that's progress. They're a part of that solution. We called for that to happen as digital citizens, collectively, us. So I think, when we say, if you look at it from, I guess, a step back, and you just see this big melee of crap that's just happening in the cyber world, yes, it can seem quite overwhelming and daunting, but the reality is that we are making strides. We are taking steps to get there, and momentum is building. Somebody mentioned earlier that we are progressing, and awareness around cybersecurity and cyber threats is increasing. Now that the snowball is rolling down that hill, we really need to push it to get more businesses and more governments and more civil society organizations to recognize the importance of this discussion, and more importantly, to recognize the value that comes from saying, hey, let's stop cyber warfare. Back to you, Gemma.
Thank you so much, Raj. Thank you. Based on what we've learned today and what Raj just said, it isn't just up to the governments to generate a response to cyber attack. Different groups have different advantages and can pull their levers to influence and enact change, which means us, and our communities, and the spaces that we represent. As of this workshop, there still, doesn't really exist a robust international laws to stop the sheer number of cyber attacks. It is up to us, like Raj said, to raise our voices, convince our leaders and policymakers, to make policymakers to begin addressing cyber war as the most important priority. And I want to go back again to how important it is for this, how important it is that the EU and United States signed on the Paris call. When world leaders sign on the call, it sends a larger message to all the nation states, all the nation states in the world, that this is priority, that this is important. And as I talk about, as I close this, I do want to open this floor on any final questions, thoughts, opinions, feelings. So yeah, so the floor is open for you guys. Melinda, you're too kind. Thank you so much. Having conversations with, uh, people across the world, participating in similar workshops, having this back and forth, sitting here and discussing about and talking about strategies, brainstorming about how we can address this very urgent issue gives me hope as well. So thank you.
Sama, you asked a really good question. What steps would we both recommend when it comes to engaging with policymakers at the national level who might not be literate in this field? Also teaching youth who might not see this as an issue to talk about it as well. Both great questions. My 2 cents before I'll hand it back to you, Gomha, is, they are complex questions. And that first one, engaging with national policymakers, I think it might not necessarily be us to, I guess, do the education. I'm not going to be someone who is going to be able to just, email a government official in Australia and say, hey, this is what cyber warfare is. Like, I'm not going to be able to give them the spiel on what state-sponsored cyber warfare means. I think for us, it's about shining a light on the issue and saying this is something that your constituents care about. This is something that us as citizens of your community care about. And I think the onus should be on our policymakers to get that education themselves. And again, I'm not saying that they are doing a great job, but currently speaking, there's a lot of investment and research going into cyberspace and cyber warfare and what that means for civilians and the impact that it's having. Yes, the education level could increase, and yes, we could see more proactive attempts at curbing the threat of cyber warfare. But I wouldn't necessarily discredit governments more broadly as being shy or avoiding the concept or not being, I guess, literate enough. I think there is definitely effort that is being made to understand the complexity that is, the nuance that is cyber warfare, but the complexity lies within international diplomacy. I think the gap is connecting those two. Like, it can be very difficult to, I guess, legislate and come or coalesce around international norms when a lot of nations don't actually agree on a lot of stuff that is outside of cyberspace currently. So we're adding another complex discussion to that point. So perhaps it shouldn't be all about literacy and education at that level, because I think it largely exists. It's more about how can we say that's something that we care about and that's something that needs to be fixed or changed. And in terms of engaging young people, talking to them in the platforms that they're on, I guess something that we do often is just engage Twitter. Jump on Twitter. So we have an active Twitter account that is consistently updated. Not only do we have the best internet cyber warfare meme content online, we also host chats and we also communicate with different industry leaders to, I guess, raise awareness. So definitely engaging with social media a little bit more for young people.
Yep. And Kat, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being in this meeting. The best way to contact us would be our collective Twitter handle, Digital Peace Now. You can always reach out. You can always, if you want to follow up on the things we're doing, there's always the website, and then there are our personal Twitter handles. Raj, what's yours? Mine is @Meher tweets. Raj, what would be your Twitter?
Yeah, easy to find me. It's at Burley Raj. Please do follow me. I only have 100 followers. Um, any love any of you can show me would be much appreciated. But definitely at Digital Peace Now is where the meme content is, and I
Yeah,
recommend
and
you follow
I
for
feel like
that.
that's yeah. So sorry to speak over you, Raj. I
No,
just get
okay.
very excited about meme content. I'm very proud of it.